Dominic Toretto thought the battle was over, but the real war was just beginning. A new enemy had arrived, stronger and deadlier than before. What happens next will leave you speechless. Watch to the end to find out, and don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. The streets of Los Angeles had changed. The neighborhood Dominic Toretto once called home was no longer the place he remembered. The buildings were more worn. The graffiti wasn't art but territorial markings, and a quiet tension loomed over the streets like an unspoken warning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows as Dominic's black Dodge Charger rumbled through the streets, the low growl of the engine filling the air. He wasn't here for nostalgia. Something had brought him back, a gut feeling that told him things were wrong. As he pulled up in front of Melvin's Diner, a place he used to visit after late-night races, the peeling paint and flickering neon sign felt eerily unchanged, but the air was heavy, the kind of weight that signaled trouble. He killed the engine and stepped out, his boots hitting the cracked pavement with purpose. Inside, the usual hum of conversation dropped to a whisper as heads turned toward him. Some with recognition, others with caution. Behind the counter, Melvin, the old diner owner, looked up, his face breaking into a tired smile. "Damn, Dom. Thought you forgot about us," he said, his voice warm but lined with worry. Dominic clasped his hand. The handshake was firm. "Couldn't stay away too long. This place wouldn't survive without me." Melvin chuckled, but his laughter quickly faded as he glanced at something behind the counter. "Things ain't the same around here, man. You probably noticed." Dominic slid into a booth by the window, his eyes scanning the street outside. Kids no longer played freely, and people peeked cautiously from behind their curtains. He didn't like it. "What kind of mess are we talking about?" Melvin exhaled, glancing toward the back. After a brief hesitation, a younger man emerged from the kitchen, Dominic's cousin, Jeffrey. He looked tense, his face worn with stress, a stark contrast to the carefree kid Dom remembered. Jeffrey nodded in greeting but didn't smile. "Bikers," Melvin finally said. "They rolled in a few months back. At first, just noise, revving engines, burnouts. Then they started pushing people around, breaking windows, slashing tires. Now they're tagging walls, scaring folks off. Nobody feels safe anymore. Cops. They don't care." Dominic's jaw tightened as he glanced out the window again. Across the street, 3 motorcycles gleamed under a street lamp, their riders leaning against them, laughing and smoking. They hadn't been there when he arrived. He knew their type, territorial, hungry for power, and always looking to prove something. Melvin's voice dropped lower. "Word is they don't like too many faces like yours hanging around here." Dominic didn't flinch. He leaned back in the booth, letting the words settle. He'd faced punks like this before, men who thought fear was power. They had no idea what real strength looked like. The diner's door jingled as a teenager rushed in, eyes wide with panic. "They're out back," he panted. 3 bikes blocking the alley. Melvin cursed under his breath, but Dominic was already on his feet, heading for the door. He didn't say a word, but the determined set of his shoulders spoke volumes. The street outside felt colder, quieter. The bikers turned as Dominic stepped out, their smirks widening. One of them, tall and broad with a snarling wolf's head patch on his jacket, stepped forward. "Nice ride," he drawled, nodding toward the Dodge Charger. His voice was low, but the threat in it was clear. Dominic's eyes didn't leave the man. "Appreciate it." The biker circled the Charger, dragging his fingers along the polished hood. "Shame if something happened to it. Streets ain't too friendly these days. You might want to park somewhere else." Dominic took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "I've been parking here since before you knew how to ride that toy of yours. I ain't moving." The biker chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Suit yourself. Just remember I warned you." He climbed onto his bike, revved the engine, and sped off, his companions following, their laughter echoing down the street. Dominic watched them disappear, his hands clenching at his sides. He didn't like threats. Threats demanded answers. When he turned back to the diner, Jeffrey was standing in the doorway, concern etched on his face. "They'll be back," Jeffrey said quietly. Dominic nodded. "Let them come." He climbed back into his Charger, the reflection of the biker tail lights lingering in his rearview mirror. Something in the air had shifted. This wasn't just noise or vandalism. This was a takeover, and if they wanted to take this neighborhood, they'd have to go through him first. The next morning, Dominic Toretto sat at Melvin's Diner, sipping a black coffee as he stared out the window at the street he once called home. The memory of the previous night replayed in his mind. Those bikers, their arrogance, their threats. He knew their kind, and he knew they weren't done. This wasn't about scaring people anymore. It was about control, and control was something Dominic wasn't about to hand over. Jeffrey sat across from him, rubbing the bruises on his knuckles from smashing through the diner's front counter. His eyes were tired, but the fire in them hadn't dimmed. You really think you can stop them, Dom? They're not just some street punks. They've got people in their pockets, maybe even the cops. Dominic set his cup down. I don't scare easy. Melvin sighed from behind the counter. You don't, but the rest of us do. People here, they've got families, they don't want trouble. Dominic met his gaze. They don't have a choice. If they don't stand up now, those guys will own this block and the next one after that. They won't stop until someone makes them. Melvin shook his head. And that someone is you. Dominic didn't answer. He didn't have to. A heavy silence settled over the diner, broken only by the distant sound of motorcycles growling down the street. We're going to need help, Jeffrey muttered, taking another sip of his drink. Dominic nodded. He already had a few names in mind. Later that day, Dominic pulled up outside an old garage on the edge of town, the scent of oil and burnt rubber filling the air. Inside, sparks flew as Tony, his old friend and mechanic, worked on an engine block. He looked up as Dominic stepped inside, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag. You back for a tune-up or something bigger? Tony asked, smirking. Something bigger, Dominic said. Need the Charger ready for anything. Bulletproof tires, reinforced frame, the works. Tony raised an eyebrow. Sounds like you're expecting a war. Dominic met his gaze. It's already here. Tony sighed but nodded. Then let's make sure you're not fighting empty-handed. That night, Dominic parked outside a dimly lit bar on the west side of town. Inside, a woman sat in the back corner, her laptop open, fingers flying across the keys. Liza, a hacker with connections deep in the city's underground, barely looked up as Dominic slid into the seat across from her. Heard you were back, she said, eyes still on her screen. Figured it wouldn't take long before you came looking for me. I need intel, Dominic said. Everything on a biker gang called the Wolf Pack. Leaders, operations, anything they've got going on. Liza finally looked at him, her lips curling into a small smirk. You don't waste time, do you? Never have. She leaned back, tapping a few keys. They're more than just a gang. Extortion, illegal street racing, arms deals. But that's not the worst part. She turned the laptop toward him. On the screen was a list of police officers, their names tied to the bikers. They've got people on the inside. Dominic clenched his jaw. How high does it go? Liza shrugged. Hard to say, but if you think the cops are going to help, don't hold your breath. Dominic exhaled slowly. Then we make our own moves. Liza shut the laptop. I'm in, but this is bigger than just taking down a few bikers, Dom. You sure you want to start this fight? He didn't hesitate. It already started. As Dominic walked back to his Charger, he knew the team was coming together. Tony was getting the car ready. Liza would keep them one step ahead, but he needed one more. Just before midnight, Dominic pulled into an abandoned parking lot where Rico, an old street racer turned small-time hustler, was leaning against his car. He looked up as Dominic stepped out. Didn't think I'd ever see you back here, Rico said, smirking. What's the deal? Got a job? Dominic said. Dangerous, but it pays in something better than money. Rico laughed. That's so, what's the payout? Taking back the streets? Rico's smile faltered and he looked away. Man, things ain't that simple anymore. These guys, they're serious. You cross them, they don't forget. Dominic stepped closer. Neither do I. Rico sighed, rubbing his chin. All right, I'm in. But don't expect me to be a hero. I don't need heroes, Dominic said. I need people who won't run when things get tough. Rico hesitated, then nodded. Guess we'll find out, won't we? With that, Dominic turned back to his car, his mind already on what was coming next. The team was assembled, the fight was coming, and he was ready. The night air was thick with tension as Dominic Toretto sat in his Dodge Charger, parked in an alley just 2 blocks from an old warehouse. The lights inside flickered as shadowy figures moved around, their voices carrying over the hum of nearby motorcycles. Liza's intel had been right. This was where the Wolfpack met with their connections inside the police force. If Dominic could get proof of their collaboration, it would expose the entire operation. But this wasn't going to be easy. Liza sat in the passenger seat, a small laptop balanced on her knees, eyes scanning live security feeds. They've been in there for 15 minutes. We wait any longer, we risk them getting spooked and moving to another location, she said, her voice low but steady. Dominic's gaze flickered to the warehouse entrance. 2 bikers stood outside, armed, scanning the street like guard dogs. We go now, he said simply, reaching for the small earpiece Liza had set up a few blocks away. Rico was positioned near the back entrance of the warehouse, his voice coming through the earpiece. I see 3 more inside, pacing near the doors. Looks like they're waiting on something or someone. Dominic opened the driver's side door, moving with quiet precision. He and Liza kept low as they approached the side of the warehouse. She plugged a small device into a junction box near the entrance, hacking into the internal security system. A moment later, the cameras inside flickered off. You've got 2 minutes before the backup system kicks in, Liza warned. Dominic slipped inside, pressing against the cold metal wall as he scanned the room. The place stank of oil and gasoline, and crates were stacked against the walls, most likely containing weapons or stolen merchandise. At the center of the room, a group of men stood in a semicircle, discussing something in hushed but firm voices. At the front of the group stood Vulcan, the second in command of the wolf pack, a man just as ruthless as Vul himself. Across from him, 2 men in dark clothing leaned in, their badges flashing briefly under the dim light. Cops, dirty ones. Dominic raised a small recording device in his hand, capturing every word. The boss wants guarantees, one of the officers said. If we keep the heat off your guys, we expect respect, full protection in return. No slip-ups. Vulcan smirked. You keep your end and we'll make sure no one messes with your operation. But we're already dealing with a problem, Toretto. Dominic's jaw tightened. One of the cops laughed. That guy. He's nothing but an old street racer playing hero. Let us handle it. We'll make sure he disappears. Vulcan nodded. Do it fast. I don't like loose ends. Dominic had heard enough. He turned, signaling to Liza and Rico that they needed to move, but just as he stepped toward the exit, his earpiece crackled with static, then a voice, low and familiar. Guys, we have a problem. Dominic's pulse quickened. Rico, what is it? A beat of silence, then Rico's voice came back, tense. They know we're here. Before Dominic could react, the warehouse doors burst open, and floodlights illuminated the entire room. Engines roared to life outside, the sound of motorcycles surrounding the building. The trap had been set. Vulcan's smirk widened. Well, look who decided to pay us a visit. Dominic didn't waste time. He shoved the recording device into his pocket and moved. A biker lunged at him, but he dodged, slamming his fist into the man's ribs before tossing him into a crate. Chaos erupted. Liza sprinted toward the exit, ducking under a swinging crowbar as she pulled out a small blade, slicing through the attacker's arm. Rico, however, was nowhere to be seen. Dominic fought his way through, knocking another man to the ground before bolting for the door. As he reached the exit, a motorcycle screeched to a stop in front of him. The rider pulled off his helmet, revealing a familiar face. Rico. Dominic froze. What the hell are you doing? Rico's face was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the handlebars. They knew Dom. They knew everything. Before we even got here. Dominic's stomach turned cold. You told them. Rico's eyes flickered with guilt. They gave me no choice. Dominic stepped forward, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. You had a choice. You always have a choice. Before Rico could respond, Vulcan and his men stormed out of the warehouse, weapons raised. Get in the car, Dominic growled at Liza. Liza hesitated for half a second before sprinting towards the Charger, yanking open the door. Vulcan raised his gun. Kill them. Dominic dived into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut just as bullets shattered the pavement behind him. He gunned the engine, tires screeching as the Charger tore down the alleyway. In the rearview mirror, motorcycles surged after them, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Liza's hands flew across her laptop, hacking into the city's traffic grid. I can give you a few seconds of green lights, but that's all. Dominic pushed the Charger harder, weaving through narrow streets. The bikers closed in fast. A sharp turn sent 2 riders skidding out, their bikes crashing into a dumpster, but the rest kept coming. Up ahead, the road split. A construction site loomed to the right. Hang on. Dominic twisted the wheel hard, sending the Charger barreling through a chain-link fence. Dust and debris exploded around them as they cut through the site. The bikers followed, but the terrain slowed them down. Dominic spotted a half-built bridge and made a split-second decision. Liza's eyes widened. Dom, you're not serious. He didn't answer. He hit the gas. The Charger launched off the edge of the unfinished bridge, soaring through the air for a breathless second. Everything went silent. Then the car slammed onto the other side, suspension groaning behind them. The bikers skidded to a halt at the edge, realizing too late they couldn't follow. Dominic exhaled, his grip tight on the wheel. That bought us time. Liza checked the laptop. Rico's still tracking us. Dominic's jaw tightened. Then let him. He made his choice. As they disappeared into the night, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about the wolf pack anymore. This was personal. The garage smelled of oil and burning rubber as Tony worked under the hood of Dominic's Dodge Charger, tightening bolts and reinforcing the frame. Sparks flew as he welded an additional layer of protection to the undercarriage. Every modification was necessary. The fight ahead wouldn't be a street race, it would be a war. Dominic stood nearby, arms crossed, watching Tony work. Liza sat on a crate, her laptop open, scrolling through lines of data. Her face was tense, eyes focused as she tracked movements across the city. The wolf pack was still looking for them. They had regrouped after the failed ambush and now they were getting ready for something bigger. "They're not letting this go," Liza muttered. "Vulcan's been seen near the docks, meeting with some heavy hitters. Word is they're planning to take over more territory and they want us gone before they do it." Dominic didn't flinch. "Let them come. We're not running." Tony wiped sweat from his forehead. "I reinforced the Charger's frame, bulletproofed the glass, and gave you a little surprise in the trunk. You get surrounded, hit that switch under the dashboard, and you'll get enough smoke to disappear." Liza snorted. "We're up against a gang that torched half this neighborhood, and your plan is a smoke bomb." Tony grinned. "It's not just smoke. Let's just say if they're close enough, they'll regret it." Dominic's gaze shifted toward the entrance as Rico stepped inside. The air in the garage turned heavy after the betrayal at the warehouse. Nobody fully trusted him, not yet. Rico stopped a few feet from Dominic, his hands in his pockets, looking uneasy. "I know I screwed up. I didn't think they'd turn on me that fast," Rico said. Dominic didn't blink. "They were always going to turn on you. You just didn't see it." Rico exhaled, shaking his head. "Look, I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I want to make this right. Vulcan's got people waiting at a storage yard tonight. If we hit them before they can organize, we might have a shot at stopping them before they make their next move." Liza narrowed her eyes. "Why should we believe you, Rico?" Rico met her gaze. "Because if I wanted you dead, I could have done it a long time ago." Silence filled the garage. Finally, Dominic nodded. "You're coming with us. You stay close, you do exactly what I say, and if you try anything..." Rico cut in, "Not again." The conversation ended there. There was no more time for doubts. As night fell, the team gathered at Melvin's diner, mapping out the attack. Liza pulled up blueprints of the storage yard on her laptop, pointing to key locations. They used this yard to move stolen goods and weapons. It's not just a hideout, it's a supply hub. If we take this down, we cut off a major part of their operation. Tony leaned over the table. "How many guys are we talking about?" Liza tapped the screen. "At least a dozen, plus reinforcements if things go sideways." Dominic studied the layout. "We going fast." Liza shuts down their cameras. Tony blocks their exit with the Charger, and Rico makes sure we're not walking into another trap. Rico nodded, though the weight of Dominic's words was clear. He wasn't fully trusted. Melvin walked over, setting down cups of coffee, his expression grim. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest, Dom. They won't let this slide." Dominic took a sip. "They already started it." Melvin sighed. "Be careful, kid." The plan was set. A little after midnight, the Charger rolled toward the storage yard, its engine humming low as Dominic kept it steady. Liza sat in the passenger seat, tapping into the security feed. "We're almost in position. Give me a few seconds and their cameras will be down." Rico was in the back, scanning the yard through binoculars. "They've got guys on the roof, two near the loading dock, one by the gate." Tony's voice crackled through the radio. "I'm in position. Just say the word." Liza typed a final command. "We're dark." Dominic exhaled. "Let's move." He killed the engine, stepping out into the cool night air. The yard was quiet, except for the occasional hum of machinery. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows as they approached the perimeter. Rico gestured toward a stack of shipping containers. "If we go around the back, we can..." A sudden flash of headlights cut through the darkness, the sound of revving engines filling the air. Liza cursed. They were waiting for us. The gates swung open and bikers poured into the yard, surrounding them. From the shadows, Vulcan stepped forward, his smirk wide. "You really thought we wouldn't see this coming?" Dominic's fists clenched. "Should have known you'd be too scared to fight fair," Vulcan laughed. "Scared? No. Prepared always." The bikers edged closer, their hands hovering over weapons. Dominic's team was outnumbered, but he wasn't about to back down. Vulcan's smirk faded. "Any last words?" Dominic didn't hesitate. "Yeah. He raised his hand. A split second later, the Charger's headlights flashed, signaling Tony. A massive explosion erupted from behind the yard as Tony's modified smoke bomb detonated, sending a thick cloud of gas billowing through the lot. Chaos exploded. Dominic lunged, slamming his fist into the closest biker. Liza ducked as a chain whipped past her head, driving her elbow into an attacker's ribs. Rico moved faster than anyone expected, grabbing a crowbar and taking down 2 bikers in one swing. Through the haze, Vulcan roared, "Get them!" Dominic turned, eyes locking on the man responsible for everything. This wasn't over, it was just getting started. The smoke was thick, curling through the storage yard as shouts rang out in the night. Dominic Toretto moved through the chaos, dodging a wild swing from a biker wielding a crowbar. He countered with a hard punch to the man's ribs, sending him staggering back. The explosion had thrown the wolf pack into disarray, but Vulcan's men were regaining control fast. The sound of motorcycles revving filled the air as more bikers poured into the yard, cutting off their escape. Liza was already working. She ducked behind a stack of crates, typing furiously on her laptop. "I'm locking the gates," she called out. "They're not getting reinforcements." Dominic twisted as another attacker lunged at him. He caught the man's wrist, twisting it violently before slamming his elbow into his jaw. The biker collapsed, unconscious, before he hit the ground. Rico was fighting near the loading dock, using a tire iron to fend off 2 bikers at once. His movements were sharp and desperate, the weight of his betrayal still hanging over him. One of the bikers landed a hit, sending him stumbling, but Rico recovered fast, sweeping the man's legs out from under him before delivering a brutal kick to the ribs. Tony's voice crackled over the radio. "I'm in position. Chargers blocking the main road. They're not getting out that way." Dominic knew they had to move fast. He spotted Vulcan through the haze, barking orders to his men. The second in command of the wolf pack wasn't as reckless as the others. He was calculating, always watching for weaknesses. Right now he was watching Dominic. "Finish them," Vulcan shouted. Dominic didn't wait. He surged forward, driving through the chaos toward Vulcan. A biker swung at him with a chain, but he ducked, grabbing the chain mid-swing and yanking hard. The biker stumbled, and Dominic drove his fist into his gut before throwing him aside. Ahead, Vulcan smirked, stepping back toward the warehouse. He wanted Dominic to follow. It was a trap. Dominic followed anyway. The warehouse was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering as he stepped inside. The smell of oil and rust filled the air. Stacked crates lined the walls, marked with smuggling codes, weapons, stolen goods, everything the wolf pack had built its empire on. Vulcan stood in the center of the room, cracking his knuckles. "I've heard a lot about you, Toretto," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "Big reputation, fast hands, but reputation doesn't mean much when you're outnumbered." Dominic didn't blink. "You talk too much." Vulcan's smirk widened. "Then let's cut to the part where I break you." He moved fast, faster than Dominic expected. The first punch landed hard against Dominic's ribs, knocking the breath from his lungs. Vulcan followed up with a brutal knee to the stomach, then an elbow to the jaw. Dominic stumbled back, tasting blood. Vulcan grinned. "Not so tough now, huh?" Dominic wiped the blood from his lip and rolled his shoulders. "I was just getting warmed up." He moved in, dodging Vulcan's next attack and countering with a heavy hook to the ribs. Vulcan grunted but didn't back down. He swung again, but Dominic caught his arm and drove his knee into Vulcan's gut before slamming him into a crate. Wood splintered as Vulcan groaned in pain. Outside, the fight was still raging. Liza had taken cover, taking down bikers with quick, precise strikes when they got too close. Rico was barely standing, breathing hard, but he refused to go down. Tony was holding the perimeter, making sure no one escaped. Vulcan pushed himself up, rage burning in his eyes. He pulled a knife from his belt. Dominic tensed, eyes tracking every movement. Vulcan lunged. Dominic sidestepped at the last second, grabbing Vulcan's wrist and twisting hard. The knife clattered to the ground. Vulcan roared in frustration and swung wildly, but Dominic caught him, lifted him off his feet, and slammed him into the concrete floor. The warehouse shook with the impact. Vulcan didn't move. Dominic exhaled, his muscles burning. He turned and grabbed a gas canister from one of the crates, ripping off the lid and dumping the fuel over the stacked weapons. Liza's voice came through the radio. "Dom, we got to go." Dominic lit a match. The flames spread fast, consuming everything in seconds. He turned and ran, sprinting out of the warehouse just as the fire roared to life behind him. The wolf pack saw the flames and panicked. Bikers scrambled to escape as the fire swallowed their supply chain, their empire burning before their eyes. Sirens blared in the distance. Liza grinned, cops are on their way, and this time they're not on Vulcan's payroll. Dominic looked at Rico, bruised and bloodied but standing. You did good, he admitted. Rico smirked weakly. Took you long enough to say it. The fight was over, the wolf pack was finished, but Dominic knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The sun rose over the neighborhood, casting a golden light over the streets that had been suffocated by fear for far too long. The aftermath of the battle at the warehouse was all over the news. The footage of the burning stockpile, the shattered remains of the Wolfpack empire, and the arrests of multiple gang members had flooded every major media outlet. The corrupt officers who had aligned themselves with Vulcan were now under investigation. Some had already been suspended, others had suddenly taken early retirement. The streets weren't safe for them anymore. Justice was finally catching up. Dominic sat on the hood of his Dodge Charger, parked outside Melvin's diner, watching as people cautiously stepped out of their homes, hesitant but hopeful. The gang's presence had been wiped out overnight, but the scars of their reign lingered. Businesses had been vandalized, families had suffered. The neighborhood wasn't just recovering from a gang problem, it was learning how to breathe again. Melvin stepped outside the diner, wiping his hands on a rag, shaking his head as he looked around. Never thought I'd see this day, he muttered. Dominic nodded. It's not over, but it's a start. The door to the diner swung open as Tony, Liza, and Rico walked out. They looked different now, like people who had just been through a war and come out on the other side, bruised but standing. Liza held up her phone, scrolling through news articles. The story is spreading. They're calling it the biggest gang takedown this city's seen in years. But the higher-ups were already trying to control the narrative. Tony folded his arms. Let me guess. They're saying it was just another turf war? Liza nodded. They're spinning it like it was an internal collapse. No mention of us, no mention of the cops who were involved. Dominic's jaw tightened. They're protecting their own. They always do. Rico exhaled, shaking his head. So what now? We just sit back and let them bury it? Liza smirked. Not a chance. I've been leaking the footage to every independent journalist I know. This isn't going away. Dominic glanced at the neighborhood, watching as a group of kids ran toward a basketball court that had been empty for months. They weren't looking over their shoulders anymore. An old man sat on his porch without fear of being harassed. A few businesses had already started repainting their storefronts, covering the gang graffiti that had marked their walls for too long. The neighborhood was changing. Tony grinned. We did good, Dom. Dominic didn't answer right away. He knew the fight had been necessary, but he also knew this wasn't the kind of battle that ended overnight. He had fought to take down the Wolfpack, but the system that allowed them to thrive was still standing. There would always be another gang, another corrupt cop, another power-hungry individual looking to fill the void. The diner's bell jingled as Melvin's wife stepped out, followed by a few locals who had gathered inside. There were nods of appreciation, murmurs of gratitude. Some people looked at Dominic like a hero, others like a man they still didn't know if they could trust. Melvin clapped a hand on his shoulder. You didn't just take them down, Dom. You gave people a reason to fight back. Dominic met his gaze, his expression unreadable. It's not about fighting back, it's about making sure they don't have to fight at all. A few feet away, Rico shifted uncomfortably. He had fought harder than anyone in the end, but the weight of his earlier betrayal still clung to him. He had proved himself, but he knew that trust wasn't something he could just win back in a night. He turned to Dominic. I meant what I said back there about making things right. Dominic studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then stick around. This place is going to need people who aren't afraid to stand their ground. Rico exhaled, nodding. Yeah, I think I can do that. Liza's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then frowned. We might have a problem. Dominic turned to her. What kind of problem? Liza looked up, her expression serious. I'm not sure yet, but it's big. A chill settled over the group. They had just won a war, but something else was already on the horizon. Dominic looked around one last time, taking in the streets, the people, the fragile sense of hope hanging in the air. He knew better than to trust the calm. He climbed into his Charger, gripping the wheel. Let's find out what we're dealing with. As the car rumbled to life, the sun climbed higher, painting the city in gold. The battle for the neighborhood was over, but the war was just beginning. The hum of the Dodge Charger's engine echoed through the quiet streets as Dominic Toretto drove through the neighborhood, his mind racing as fast as the car itself. The battle against the Wolfpack was over, but Liza's words still lingered. We might have a problem. He had learned a long time ago never to ignore instincts, and Liza's instincts were rarely wrong. The city didn't rest, and neither did trouble. He pulled up outside Melvin's diner, where the rest of the team was already waiting. Liza sat at a booth in the back, her laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. Tony leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her screen. Rico sat near the window, his expression unreadable as he tapped his fingers restlessly on the table. Liza didn't look up as Dominic walked in. "We've got movement," she said, her voice tense. "It's not just leftovers from the wolf pack. Someone else is making moves and they're doing it fast." Dominic pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Who?" Liza clicked a few keys, pulling up a grainy surveillance image. The photo showed a convoy of black SUVs rolling through the industrial district, their windows tinted, their presence unmistakably deliberate. These guys aren't small time. They don't operate like street gangs, no patches, no flash. They move quietly and they move together. Tony leaned in, narrowing his eyes at the image. Whoever they are, they're not wasting time. The wolf pack barely hit the ground, and these guys are already filling the space they left behind. Dominic studied the screen. "You got a name?" Liza hesitated. "Not exactly, but I've been picking up chatter, people calling them the Syndicate." Rico scoffed. "Great. Sounds friendly." Dominic wasn't surprised. When power shifts, something always comes to take its place. The wolf pack had been a street-level operation, but if this new group was operating in silence, that meant they were organized. They weren't looking for attention, they were looking for control. Liza clicked again, pulling up another video. This was taken last night in the warehouse district. The footage was shaky, recorded from a distance, but the picture was clear enough. A group of men stood in a tight formation outside a shipping facility, guns strapped to their sides, earpieces in their ears. This wasn't a gang, this was something else. Then the camera panned slightly and Dominic's eyes narrowed. A man stood at the center of the group, his back turned to the camera. His stance was rigid, military-like, exuding the kind of confidence that came from knowing no one would dare cross him. He turned slightly, just enough for the light to catch his face. Dominic exhaled through his nose. "Who the hell is that?" Tony asked. Liza's jaw was tight. "His name is C. Varga, former private security. He used to run contracts overseas before he disappeared off the grid a few years ago. Word is, he's the one pulling the strings behind the syndicate." Dominic leaned back, processing the information. This wasn't just another street gang. This was a machine. "How bad are we talking?" Rico asked, but his tone already suggested he knew the answer. Liza's fingers hesitated over the keyboard before she turned the screen toward them. A different image appeared. A crime scene, police tape stretched across the frame. The bodies of two former Wolfpack members lay sprawled on the ground, their motorcycles still burning in the background. "That bad," she said. "They're not just taking over, they're erasing everything that came before them." A silence settled over the group. Tony shook his head. "They're making an example out of anyone who gets in their way." Rico rubbed the back of his neck, his leg bouncing anxiously. "Which means they're going to come looking for us next." Dominic's fingers drummed against the table. He had seen this before. The wolf pack had been reckless, loud, and easy to bait into making mistakes. This was different. The syndicate was patient, methodical. They wouldn't make a move unless it was calculated. That made them more dangerous. Liza tapped another key and a list of names appeared on the screen. I started digging. These are people connected to the syndicate. Business owners, shipping managers, cops. They don't operate like a gang, Dom. They operate like a corporation. Dominic didn't need to ask what that meant. "They're already inside," he said. Liza nodded. "And if they get comfortable, we'll never get them out." Tony exhaled sharply. "So what's the play?" Dominic glanced toward the window, watching as the neighborhood slowly came to life for the first time in months. People weren't walking in fear. He wasn't about to let that slip away. "We find them first," he said, "before they settle in." Rico shifted. "And if they don't scare easy?" Dominic's gaze hardened. "Then we remind them whose streets these are." The decision was made. Liza shut her laptop. "I'll keep tracking them, but we need eyes on the ground. If they look careful, we won't get second chances." Tony cracked his knuckles. "Then we make the first one count." The diner door opened as Melvin walked in, taking one look at the table before shaking his head. "You all just finished burning one gang to the ground, and now you're already looking at another one." Dominic didn't look away from the window. "If we don't stop this now, we'll be dealing with something a lot worse." Melvin sighed. Guess I'll keep the coffee brewing then? The group stood, each of them knowing that they were stepping into something even bigger than before. The battle with the wolf pack had been personal. This was a war for control. Dominic adjusted his jacket and walked toward the door. The Charger sat at the curb, waiting. The streets were quiet, but he knew better than to trust the silence. As he opened the door and slid behind the wheel, Liza's voice came from behind him. "You sure you want to start this fight?"